There are few moments in the grim annals of the galaxy's history more profound than those when silence is finally broken. For 60 million years, the Silent King had wandered the void beyond the rim of known space, carrying the weight of his people's damnation like a crown of thorns upon his metallic brow. Zarek had sought redemption in exile, not for himself, but for the choice that had doomed an entire species to eternal unlife. Yet what he discovered in that endless darkness was not absolution, but a horror that dwarfed even the sins of the Necrontire. The great rift had torn the galaxy asunder, spilling the madness of the warp across countless worlds. Chaos roamed free, while the Imperium of man bled from 1,000 wounds. Yet even as brother fought brother and demon engines stalked the stars, the Silent King had witnessed something that made all such conflicts seem like the petty squabbles of children in the cold void between galaxies where no star had ever burned. Movement stirred. Not the movement of ships or worlds, but the writhing of something vast beyond comprehension. The bioships came not as a fleet, but as a living tide that stretched across light years. Hive Fleet Ouroboros, as his cryptex had designated the approaching swarm, possessed a scope that rendered all previous Tyranid invasions mere scouting forces. The Silent King had watched worlds consumed by Kraken and Behemoth, had seen entire sectors stripped of life by Leviathan. Yet those fleets were but tendrils compared to the vast bulk of the creature now approaching the galaxy's edge. This was not invasion, but migration. The great devourer was coming home. Zarek's flagship, the Obsidian Mausoleum, hung in the void at the galaxy's rim like a black needle against the stars. Around him, his cryptex worked with desperate precision at their esoteric instruments, measuring and calculating the impossible mathematics of extinction. The readings had not changed in the week since their return. The megaswarm would reach the outer rim worlds within solar months. After that, consumption would spread like a plague across every inhabited system until nothing remained but silence. For the first time in 60 million years, the Silent King spoke aloud. His voice, when it came, was the sound of tomb doors grinding open, of ancient mechanisms awakening from endless slumber. "How long?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Cryptek Ankh-Efen Khonsu, oldest of the Silent King's advisors, turned from his calculations with movements that spoke of vast weariness. "The outer worlds will fall within a solar year, my lord. The core systems—" He paused, reviewing data that defied comprehension. "Perhaps a century, if every faction fights with perfect coordination. More likely, far less." The Silent King considered this. A century was nothing to a being who had existed for 60 million years. Yet for the organic life forms that still clung to existence across the galaxy, it was the span of entire civilizations. Enough time for hope, perhaps. Enough time for unity. "The astropathic networks," Zarek said, his voice carrying the weight of an unprecedented decision. "Can they be commandeered?" Ankh-Efen Khonsu's optical sensors flickered with something that might have been surprise. "My lord, such an action would reveal our presence to every faction in the galaxy. The Imperium's reaction alone will be irrelevant if they are consumed." The Silent King's gaze turned toward the galactic core, where the light of 1,000,000,000,000 stars painted the void in pale fire. "For 60 million years, I have maintained the great silence, believing that isolation would spare what remained of life from our cursed existence. Yet what approaches cares nothing for our guilt or our redemption. The great devourer will consume Necron and human alike, Eldar and Orc, without distinction or mercy." The cryptek bowed his head, understanding flooding through his consciousness. "You mean to warn them?" I mean to save them. Zarek's words carried the finality of a tomb sealing shut. Prepare the transmission arrays, all of them. Every astropathic relay from here to Holy Terra must carry the same message. As his cryptex worked to breach the galaxy's communication networks, the Silent King composed words that had never been spoken across the void. Not since the war in heaven had the Necrons willingly communicated with the younger races. Now, extinction demanded what pride had forbidden. The transmission went out on every frequency, carried by commandeered astropaths whose minds screamed in unison across the galaxy. It reached the throne room on Macraga, where Guilliman studied reports of increased Tyranid activity. It touched the mind of Eldrad Ulthran as he meditated in the depths of Ulthwe. It penetrated even the ethereal chambers of Toe Space, where the supreme ethereal felt alien thoughts pressing against the boundaries of his consciousness. The message was simple, terrible in its clarity. Children of the galaxy, your extinction approaches. What comes from beyond the rim will devour all. Imperium and Xenos, chaos and order, all are meat to the great devourer. Yet perhaps, if all unite as one, some fragment of life might endure. This is Zarek, last of the Silent Kings. I who damned my people to unlife, now offer what aid I can to preserve what yet breathes. The choice is yours, unity or extinction. Across the galaxy, the reaction was immediate and fractured. On Holy Terra, custodian officers rushed to bring word to the master of mankind himself, though the Emperor's will remained unreadable behind his eternal silence. In the Eye of Terror, Abaddon felt the message like cold iron pressed against his soul. Recognizing a threat that transcended even the Long War, the Tau received the communication with the calculated precision their species was known for. Watercast diplomats, already crafting responses to this unprecedented overture. Yet it was among the Eldar that the message struck deepest. Eldrad had foreseen fragments of this moment across the millennia, visions of unity forged in desperation. The paths of fate that had seemed impossible were suddenly blazing with terrible clarity. For the first time in 10,000 years, every major thread of the future pointed toward the same necessity: cooperation or consumption. The Silent King felt the psychic shock waves of a galaxy forced to confront its mortality. Fear, disbelief, rage, and desperate hope crashed against his consciousness like waves against a tomb wall. Some would refuse to listen. Others would see only opportunity in the chaos. But enough would understand. Enough would choose survival over pride. The great devourer was coming, yet for the first time in 60 million years, Zarek allowed himself to hope that when it arrived, it would find not scattered prey, but united defiance. The galaxy's children would stand together, or they would fall as one. Either way, the age of isolation had ended. In the cold void beyond the galaxy's edge, something vast and hungry stirred in the darkness between stars. The taste of approaching life filled the synapses of a consciousness larger than worlds. Soon it would feed. Soon, all would be consumed and reborn in the perfection of the swarm. But first, it would have to break the most unlikely alliance the galaxy had ever seen. The war for existence itself was about to begin. The truth has a weight that breaks even the strongest minds. Across the galaxy, faction leaders who had spent millennia waging war upon each other now faced a revelation that rendered their conflicts meaningless. The Silent King's message echoed through the minds of astropaths like the tolling of funeral bells, each word carrying the promise of extinction. Yet words alone might have been dismissed as the ravings of an ancient machine. What followed left no room for doubt. In the fortress of Hera on Macraga, Robut Gilliman stood before the great strategium as reports flooded in from across the Imperium. The Primarch's face bore the weight of 10,000 years, lines of exhaustion carved deep by the burden of humanity's survival. Before him, hololithic displays painted a picture that defied comprehension, bioship signatures, massive beyond any previously recorded, moving through the void between galaxies like a slow tide of death. "My lord," Captain Sicarius said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "The astropathic choir reports contact with forward elements. The readings—" He paused, struggling with words that seemed too terrible to speak. "They suggest vessels the size of moons, Lord Gilliman. Hundreds of them." Gilliman studied the tactical displays with the eye of a general who had fought wars across 1,000 worlds. The formations were familiar, yet wrong, recognizably Tyranid in their organic flow, yet possessing a scope that dwarfed every previous invasion. Kraken had been defeated through unity and sacrifice. Behemoth had been broken upon the walls of Macraga itself. Yet this approaching swarm rendered those threats as mere probing attacks against what now came to feed. "Send word to the chapter masters," Gilliman commanded. "Full mobilization of all available forces. And—" He hesitated, the weight of necessity forcing words he had never thought to speak. "Prepare diplomatic channels to the Tau Empire and to Ulthwé." Far across the galaxy, in the roiling madness of the Eye of Terror, Abaddon the Despoiler received confirmation of the threat through means far more visceral. The vengeful spirit hung in the warp-torn void of Maleum, its hull scarred by 10 millennia of warfare against the false emperor. Yet even here, in the heart of chaos itself, the great devourer's hunger reached. The first bioships had emerged not from real space, but from the warp itself, their forms adapted to survive in the realm of pure emotion and madness. They did not corrupt as mortal flesh did, nor were they driven mad by proximity to the chaos gods. Instead, they fed upon the very essence of the warp, consuming demon and cultist alike with mechanical efficiency. Abaddon stood upon the bridge as his sorcerers reported the impossible. "War Master," Zaraphiston said, his voice distorted by the mechanical grill of his helm. "The entities consume even our blessed corruption. They do not fall to chaos. They digest it." The Despoiler's eyes blazed with fury that had burned for 10,000 years. He had spent millennia fighting to overthrow the Corpse Emperor, to bring the galaxy under the dominion of the dark gods. Yet what use was conquest if nothing remained to rule? The Tyranids offered not victory, but oblivion. Not glory, but the silence of the grave. "Summon the Legion commanders," Abaddon said, his voice carrying the authority of one who had never known defeat. "And prepare long-range communications with—" The words came hard, forced through a throat that had spoken only hatred for the Imperium. "With Macraga." On the craft world Ulthwé, Eldrad Ulthran sat within the chamber of the Seer Council, his ancient mind touching the threads of fate that stretched across time and space. The Infinity Circuit sang around him with the voices of the dead, 10,000 years of Eldar souls, lending their wisdom to the greatest farseer of their dying race. Yet even their collective knowledge paled before the vision that now filled his sight. He saw the galaxy as the Tyranids saw it, not as worlds and peoples and civilizations, but as biomass to be consumed. Stars were reduced to simple calculations of energy yield. Planets became estimates of genetic material to be absorbed. The infinite complexity of life was reduced to raw numbers in the hive mind's vast equation of hunger. Yet within that terrible vision, Eldrad glimpsed something else. Threads of possibility that had seemed impossible. Futures where the ancient enemies of his people fought alongside them against the greater darkness. The Mon Ki with their crude loyalty, the Tau with their naive optimism, even the Necrons, soulless though they were, bound by the same desperate need to preserve what remained of the galaxy. "Summon the Autarchs," Eldrad commanded, his voice echoing through the crystalline chambers of the craft world. "Prepare the webway gates for unexpected guests." In the heart of Toe space, on the world of Toe itself, the Ethereal Supreme sat in emergency conclave with the highest ranks of his people's leadership. The Firecast commanders spoke of border worlds that had simply vanished from long-range sensors, their signals cut off mid-transmission. Watercast diplomats reported the breakdown of all contact with outer colonies, their carefully maintained trade networks severed like cut strings. The Earthcast presented their analysis with characteristic precision. "The consumption rate is consistent with previous Tyranid invasions," Aunva said, his voice carrying the weight of supreme authority. "Yet the scale suggests biomass requirements that exceed the total biological content of our empire by orders of magnitude." Commander Shadowsun, veteran of countless battles against the Imperium, found herself facing an enemy that cared nothing for the greater good. "Honored Ethereal," she said, "our doctrine has always emphasized the conversion of enemy forces to our cause. The Tyranids cannot be reasoned with. They cannot be converted. They can only be destroyed." "Then we must seek allies who share our need for survival," the Ethereal Supreme replied. "Prepare communications with the human worlds, and with the Eldar. The greater good must expand beyond the boundaries of species, or it will perish entirely." Across the galaxy, the first tentative communications began, not through the traditional channels of diplomacy and trade, but through the commandeered astropathic networks that the Silent King had opened. Encoded messages passed between sworn enemies, each faction reaching out in desperation to those they had fought for millennia. The Imperium's response came first, carried by astropaths whose minds bore the strain of communicating with Xenos consciousness. Gilliman's message was simple: "The Emperor protects those who stand against extinction. Terms will be discussed." The Tau replied through their own limited psychic assets, their message filtered through the precise calculations of the Watercast. "The greater good encompasses all who choose survival over destruction. We are prepared to negotiate." From Ulthwe came visions shared across the psychic void, images of possible futures where unity triumphed over consumption. Eldrad's response needed no words. The futures he showed spoke more clearly than any diplomatic protocol. Even from the Eye of Terror, Abaddon's reply reached across the galaxy, carried by sorcerers who had spent lifetimes learning to manipulate the warp. "The long war is meaningless if there are none left to rule. The Black Legion stands ready." The Silent King received these responses from his position at the galaxy's rim, his ancient consciousness processing each faction's willingness to set aside old hatreds. It was not trust that bound them. Trust required time they did not possess. It was not friendship, for such bonds could not be forged across aeons of warfare. It was necessity, pure and simple, the choice between cooperation and extinction. Yet as the first bioships reached the outer systems, their vanguard organisms beginning the systematic consumption of isolated worlds, even necessity might not be enough. The Tyranids had learned from their previous encounters with the galaxy's defenders. They came now not as separate fleets to be defeated in detail, but as a unified swarm that adapted and evolved with each world they consumed. The weight of truth settled upon the galaxy like a shroud. Unity was no longer an idealistic dream, but a desperate requirement for survival. The great devourer was coming, and only by standing as one could the children of the galaxy hope to remain anything more than food for the infinite hunger that approached from the dark between the stars. In the void between galaxies, the hive mind stirred with something that might have been anticipation. It had consumed 1,000 galaxies across the eons, each adding to its vast store of biological knowledge. Yet never before had it encountered prey that might unite against consumption. The prospect was intriguing. New genetic patterns to analyze, new forms of cooperation to digest and improve upon. The hunt would be more challenging than expected. This only made the eventual feast all the sweeter. Diplomacy is the art of speaking softly while carrying a sword. Yet what approached Macragga carried weapons that could shatter worlds. The fortress of Hera had stood for 10,000 years as a bastion of imperial might, its void shields and defensive batteries prepared to face any threat that might dare approach the realm of Ultramar. Yet nothing in the fortress's long history had prepared its defenders for the sight of ancient enemies, arriving not as conquerors, but as supplicants, seeking alliance against a greater darkness. The first to arrive was the Silent King himself, his tomb ship emerging from the warp with the terrible majesty of a living monument. The obsidian mausoleum phased through Macragga's orbital defenses, not through violence, but through technology so advanced that the Imperial sensors could barely register its passage. Defense platforms that had been programmed to fire upon any Xenos vessel found their targeting systems confused by matter that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Captain Sicarius stood upon the command bridge of the orbital fortress Gallatin, his face pale with the impossibility of his orders. "My lord," he voxed to Guilliman, "the Xenos vessel has entered high orbit. Our weapons cannot achieve lock. It appears to be—" He struggled for words that could encompass the impossible. "It appears to be waiting for permission to proceed." From the depths of the fortress of Hera, Robut Guilliman's voice carried across the Vox network with the authority of a demigod forced to make choices no Primarch should ever face. "Grant them passage to the landing zones, full honors, but maintain readiness for treachery." The obsidian mausoleum descended through Macragga's atmosphere like a falling star carved from midnight itself. As it settled upon the ancient landing field before the fortress of Hera, the very stones beneath it seemed to age and crumble, touched by the Necron vessel's temporal distortion fields. When the boarding ramp extended, the figure that emerged carried with him the weight of 60 million years and the burden of choices that had damned an entire species. Zarek, the Silent King, walked alone across the landing field, his form a study in ancient regality and terrible purpose. Behind him, no retinue followed, for his cryptex remained aboard the tomb ship, monitoring the approaches for signs of the coming swarm. This was not a conquest, but a supplication. Not the arrival of an emperor, but the pilgrimage of one who sought redemption through unity. The Primarch met him at the gates of the fortress, two beings of immense power facing each other across 10,000 years of mutual enmity. Guilliman wore the armor of fate, each piece bearing the honors of 1,000 victories against the enemies of mankind. The Silent King was clad in the raiment of the last Necron-Tyre ruler, metal and circuitry fused with technologies that predated the rise of humanity by millions of years. "I am Robut Guilliman," the Primarch said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Lord Commander of the Imperium, Primarch of the 13th Legion. You stand upon the soil of Ultramar, not as conqueror, but as—" "What precisely?" The Silent King's voice, when it came, was the sound of stellar winds across the void, of time itself given speech. "I am Zarek, last of the Silent Kings, herald of extinction and seeker of unity. I come not to rule, but to preserve. Not to conquer, but to ensure that something of life survives what approaches from beyond the stars. Before Guilliman could respond, the air within the fortress courtyard shimmered with psychic energy. Reality bent and twisted as a portal opened in the fabric of space itself, revealing the crystalline passages of the Eldar webway. From that impossible aperture stepped Eldrad Ulthran, Farseer of Ulthwe, his ancient eyes carrying the weight of prophecies that stretched across millennia. The Eldar's arrival sent ripples of alarm through the assembled Imperial forces. Weapons were raised, and targeting runes activated before Guilliman's raised hand stayed their fire. Eldrad moved with the fluid grace of his people, his staff clicking against the stone as he approached the unlikely gathering. "Lord Guilliman," Eldrad said, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke to the soul itself. "I have walked the paths of possibility for 1,000 of your years, seeking the threads that lead to survival rather than extinction. All paths converge upon this moment, this choice, unity or oblivion. There is no middle ground." The Farseer turned to the Silent King, and for a moment, beings older than human civilization regarded each other with something approaching respect. "Zarek of the Necrontyr," Eldrad said, "your people's curse and ours are different in nature, but equal in their burden. Perhaps in unity, both may find what redemption is possible." From the skies above came the thunder of atmospheric entry as craft of markedly different design descended toward the fortress. The lead vessel bore the elegant curves and clean lines of Tau engineering, its hull gleaming with the blue and white colors of the watercast. Ambassador Poro Mark emerged from the craft with the measured confidence of a diplomat trained to negotiate with species whose thought patterns defied Tau understanding. "Honored leaders," the Tau said, his voice carrying the calm authority of one who had spent decades learning to communicate across species barriers. "The Ethereal Supreme extends greetings to this unprecedented gathering. The greater good encompasses all who choose survival over destruction, cooperation over conquest." Behind the Tau delegation came a sight that tested even Guilliman's legendary composure. The massive transport that settled upon the landing field bore the crude but effective markings of Orc engineering, its hull scarred by countless battles and decorated with trophies that spoke of victories across 100 worlds. From its cargo bay emerged Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka himself, the beast of Armageddon, whose very presence had triggered some of the bloodiest wars in Imperial history. Yet the massive Orc war boss approached not with the swagger of a conqueror, but with the purposeful stride of one who had received visions from gods of war themselves. His scarred face bore an expression that few humans had ever seen upon an Orc, thoughtful consideration mixed with anticipation of the greatest fight the galaxy had ever known. "Gork and Mork spoke to me," Gazkul rumbled, his voice carrying across the courtyard like distant thunder. "They said the biggest fight's comin', but it ain't gonna be fun unless we all fight together. Never thought I'd say dis, but we's gonna need each other." The final arrival came not from the skies but from the shadows themselves. Reality twisted and darkened as a portal opened to the dark city of Comora, and from that realm of perpetual night stepped a figure whose presence made even the hardened veterans of the Ultramarines reach for their weapons. Asdrubal Vecht, supreme overlord of the Dark Eldar, emerged from his domain for the first time in millennia, driven by the one force that could compel even the master of Comora to seek alliance with those he considered lesser beings, self-preservation. The Archon wore armor that was a masterwork of cruel artistry, each piece designed to inspire terror and proclaim dominance. Yet he approached the gathering not as a predator seeking prey, but as a survivor, recognizing that even the Dark City's twisted paradise would become nothing more than biomass if the Great Devourer consumed the galaxy. "How deliciously ironic," Vecht said, his voice silk wrapped around razors. "That salvation should require alliance with those we have tormented for millennia. Yet even Komara's eternal pleasures pale before the prospect of extinction. The Dark City offers its unique expertise to this alliance of necessity." Guilliman stood before this unprecedented gathering, representatives of species that had waged war upon each other since before the rise of the Imperium. The Silent King, ancient beyond measure and bearing the guilt of his people's damnation. Eldrad, whose visions had guided the Eldar through 10,000 years of decline. Poromark, speaking for an empire that sought to bring order to the galaxy through unity. Gazakul, whose very existence embodied the brutal joy of eternal warfare. Vecht, master of a realm built upon suffering and dominance. Each had come to Macragge carrying the hopes and fears of their people. Each represented civilizations that had defined themselves through opposition to the others. Yet each now faced the same terrible choice. Set aside the hatreds of millennia or watch everything they had built consumed by an enemy that cared nothing for their conflicts. 10,000 years ago, Guilliman said, his voice carrying across the courtyard and beyond, transmitted by Vox networks to every corner of the galaxy. My father sought to unite humanity under a single banner. Today, we face a threat that makes such unity seem a small and provincial dream. The Great Devourer approaches, and it will consume Imperium and Eldar, Tau and Orc, Necron and Dark Eldar alike, unless we stand together. The Primarch's gaze moved across the assembled representatives, each figure representing eons of warfare and mutual hatred. I propose not friendship, for that is beyond us. I propose not trust, for that must be earned through deed rather than word. I propose necessity, the choice between cooperation and extinction. Let us find what common ground exists in the shadow of annihilation. Above them, the stars of Ultramar shone with their eternal light, yet each present knew that light would be snuffed out forever if they failed in this moment. The age of isolation was ending, not through choice, but through necessity. The children of the galaxy would stand together, or they would fall separately to a hunger that knew no bounds. In the void between galaxies, the hive mind stirred with something approaching interest. Unity among prey species was rare, but not unknown. It had consumed such alliances before, learning much from their desperate cooperation. This galaxy's attempt at unity would provide new genetic templates, new forms of organization to digest and improve upon. The feast would be all the more satisfying for the struggle that preceded it. History turns upon moments that seem impossible until they become inevitable. In the great hall of the fortress of Hera, beneath vaulted ceilings that had witnessed the planning of 1,000 victories, representatives of species that had known only war now gathered to forge the most unlikely alliance the galaxy had ever seen. The ancient stones themselves seemed to tremble with the weight of what transpired, as if the very foundations of Ultramar recognized that this day would echo across the ages. The circular table at the hall's center had been hastily modified to accommodate beings of vastly different physiologies and requirements. Guilliman sat at its head, the armor of fate gleaming in the light of suspensor lamps that had been adjusted to accommodate Eldar visual spectrums and Tau optical requirements. To his right, the Silent King's form cast shadows that seemed to bend space itself, while Eldrad's presence created subtle ripples in the psychic atmosphere that made even the most battle-hardened space marines uneasy. Across from them, Poromark maintained the serene composure that marked the finest of the water caste, his Tau physiology adapted for the marathon negotiations that had united dozens of species under the banner of the greater good. Gazgakul occupied a reinforced section of the hall, his massive frame barely contained by furniture that groaned under his weight, while Asdrubal Vecht had chosen to remain standing, his dark presence seeming to drink in the light around him. Yet it was the figure who entered last that commanded the most attention from the assembled Imperial forces. Commissar General Sebastian Yarrick, hero of Armageddon and the only human ever to earn the respect of Gazgakul himself, walked with the measured stride of one who had faced death across 100 battlefields. His bionic eye gleamed with cold fire as he took his place at the table, representing not just the Astra Militarum, but the indomitable will of humanity itself. "We are gathered," Guilliman began, his voice carrying the authority of one born to command, not in friendship, but in necessity. The threat that approaches transcends every conflict that has divided us. Today, we must speak not as conquerors or conquered, but as children of this galaxy who would see it survive. The Silent King was the first to respond, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of technologies beyond imperial comprehension. "Words alone will not suffice against what comes. You must see what I have seen, understand what your species has never faced." From his form, hololithic projectors created images that filled the air above the table with terrible clarity. The bioships that materialized in three-dimensional light were larger than any previously recorded, their forms adapted for voyage between galaxies rather than mere interstellar travel. Yet it was their number that struck the assembled representatives silent. Where previous Tyranid invasions had numbered in the thousands of vessels, Hive Fleet Ouroboros stretched across light years, a living constellation of hunger that dwarfed every fleet the galaxy had ever assembled. "This is not invasion," Zarek continued, manipulating the display to show consumption patterns that reduced worlds to mathematical abstractions. "This is migration. They flee something in the void beyond our galaxy, something that forced even the great devourer to seek new feeding grounds. We are not facing attackers but refugees whose only sustenance is life itself." Eldrad's response came not in words, but in visions shared directly through the psychic space that connected all present. The Farseer's consciousness touched each mind with futures that blazed with terrible possibility. They saw worlds stripped of atmosphere, consumed not just of life, but of the very capacity to sustain it. They witnessed the hive mind's adaptation, each consumed species adding to its vast catalogue of biological possibilities. "The paths converge upon extinction," Eldrad said, his voice carrying echoes of prophecy across millennia. "Yet in this gathering, I perceive threads that lead elsewhere. Unity forged not in triumph, but in desperation. Victory measured not in conquest, but in survival." Poromark leaned forward, his movements precise with the calculated grace of his species. "The greater good has always sought to unite disparate peoples under a common cause. Yet never has that cause been survival itself. The Tau Empire offers our technological resources, our fleet assets, and our experience in multi-species cooperation. The question is whether such cooperation can extend beyond the philosophical to the practical." It was Gazkul who answered, his massive fist striking the reinforced table with enough force to crack ceramite. "That's what makes it proper," the Orc war boss rumbled, his scarred face splitting in a grin that revealed tusks stained with the blood of 1,000 battles. "Never fought alongside Dahumis before. Never thought I'd want to. But this This is gonna be the biggest fight the galaxy ever seen. And it ain't gonna be any fun if we's all dead before it gets good." Vekt's laughter was silk wrapped around poison, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. How deliciously ironic that salvation should require such intimate cooperation. The Dark City has thrived for millennia on the suffering of lesser species. Yet even Komarag's eternal pleasures mean nothing if there are no souls left to torment. Consider our unique expertise offered in the spirit of enlightened self-interest. The negotiations that followed tested every diplomatic protocol ever devised. Resource allocation between species that measured wealth in fundamentally different ways. Command structures that had to account for beings who thought in timeframes spanning from seconds to millennia. Technological integration between factions whose very approaches to science were mutually incompatible. It was Yarrick who cut through the complexity with the blunt pragmatism that had made him a legend among the Astra Militarum. I fought Orcs, Eldar, Tau, and Chaos across 5 decades of warfare. I've learned to respect the enemy even when I cannot understand them. But the Tyranids... He paused, his bionic eye focusing on each representative in turn. They cannot be reasoned with. They cannot be bribed. They cannot be converted or corrupted. They can only be fought with every weapon, every stratagem, every life we can muster. The old soldier's words carried a weight that resonated with every faction present. Each had faced the Tyranids before, in smaller numbers and limited engagements. Each had learned the same terrible lesson. The great devourer could not be deterred, only destroyed. Then we established protocols for integration, Guilliman said, his strategic mind already working through the implications. Imperial void shields combined with Tau shield generators and Necron temporal barriers. Eldar webway gates providing rapid reinforcement across vast distances. Orc ingenuity supplementing conventional engineering with unconventional solutions. The Silent King's response carried approval that transcended species boundaries. The Necron dynasties will provide pylons to anchor defensive positions. Our Gauss technology can disrupt Tyranid bioship hulls in ways conventional weapons cannot, and our understanding of biotransference may prove crucial if the hive mind attempts to corrupt rather than consume. The infinity circuits hold the wisdom of our ancestors, Eldrad added, strategic knowledge spanning millions of years, and the webway can provide sanctuary for non-combatants when worlds fall. Not all battles can be won, but lives may yet be preserved. The formal document that emerged from hours of negotiation was unlike any treaty in galactic history. Written in Gothic, Tau, Eldar script, and Necron glyphs, it bound together species whose very existence had been defined by opposition to each other. The Macragge Accords, as they came to be known, established joint command protocols, resource-sharing agreements, and rules of engagement that accounted for the fundamental differences in how each species waged war. The signing itself became a ceremony that reflected the nature of those who signed it. Guilliman marked the document with his blood, as was the tradition of the Ultramarines when sealing oaths of ultimate importance. The Silent King's signature was etched in living metal that reformed itself into Necron glyphs. Eldrad touched the parchment with psychic energy that left it shimmering with otherworldly light. Poro Mark applied the water-cast diplomatic seal with the precision his people brought to all endeavors, while Gazgakul left his mark in the form of a massive thumbprint impressed directly into the table itself. Vekt's contribution was a single drop of poison that somehow preserved rather than destroyed the document, a dark Eldar paradox made manifest. Yarrick was the last to sign, his name written in the same hand that had authored 1,000 battle reports. "For the Emperor," he said quietly, "and for all who would see tomorrow's dawn." As the ceremony concluded, each representative understood that they had committed their civilizations to a course that might preserve the galaxy, or doom it to a death more terrible than simple consumption. The alliance they had forged was not built on trust or friendship, but on the simple recognition that extinction was the only alternative to cooperation. Above Macragga, the stars shone with their ancient light, yet those gathered in the fortress of Hera knew that light was no longer eternal. In the void between galaxies, the great devourer approached with infinite hunger and patience. The first moves had been made in a game whose stakes were nothing less than the survival of all sentient life. The unity they had achieved was fragile, held together by necessity rather than affection. Yet it was unity nonetheless, and perhaps that would be enough when the darkness finally arrived at the galaxy's edge. In the depths of space beyond the galactic rim, the hive mind stirred with something that might have been anticipation. Unity among prey species was rare, but not unknown. Each previous alliance had ultimately fallen to internal division and conflicting priorities. This galaxy's attempt at cooperation would provide valuable data on the limits of cross-species collaboration. The feast would be all the more instructive for the lessons learned in its consumption. War is the ultimate test of any alliance, for it strips away diplomacy and reveals whether cooperation can survive the crucible of violence and death. 3 days after the signing of the Macragga Accords, the galaxy's most unlikely alliance faced its first trial by fire as Hive Fleet Prometheus, a vanguard tendril of the Greater Swarm, emerged from the void to probe the defenses of the Kithra system. What followed would determine whether unity forged in desperation could endure the harsh reality of coordinated warfare. The combined fleet that assembled at Kithra's edge was a sight that defied 10 millennia of galactic history. Imperial Navy battleships hung in formation alongside elegant Tau vessels, their hulls gleaming with the blue and white of the watercast. Necron tomb ships phased in and out of reality, their ancient hulls bearing technology that predated the rise of humanity. Eldar vessels danced through the void with impossible grace, while Orc rocks and converted hulks brought crude but effective firepower to the coalition. Admiral Quintanus of the Imperial Navy stood upon the bridge of the battle barge Invincible Reason, his weathered face reflecting the strain of commanding forces that included species he had spent decades fighting. Beside him, Commander Shadowsun of the Tau Fourth Sphere Expansion Fleet studied tactical displays that showed enemy movements in real time, her advanced sensors sharing data with Imperial auger arrays for the first time in either species' history. Hive Fleet Prometheus consists of 47 major bioships and supporting organisms, Shadowsun reported, her voice carrying the calm precision that marked the finest of Tau military doctrine. Their formation suggests standard Tyranid probe tactics, but adapted for multi-vector assault patterns. The Eldar contribution came not through conventional communication, but through psychic projection, as Farseer Taldir of Ulthwé shared visions of the battle's potential outcomes directly with the Allied commanders. Her consciousness touched each mind briefly, showing threads of possibility that branched and converged with every tactical decision. From the Necron tomb ship World Engine, Overlord Anrakir's transmission arrived through quantum entanglement, his ancient voice carrying across the void with mechanical precision. Tyranid bioacids have proven effective against conventional armor plating. Necron phase shielding will provide protection for Allied vessels during close engagement. Coordinate your attack vectors with our temporal displacement fields. The first phase of the assault began with long-range bombardment, as Imperial macro cannons and Tau railgun batteries opened fire in precise sequence. The bioships of Hive Fleet Prometheus responded with living projectiles that writhed through space, seeking to close distance and board the Allied vessels. Yet where previous encounters had seen individual fleets overwhelmed by Tyranid adaptability, the combined firepower proved devastating. Tau marker lights designated priority targets, while Imperial targeting cogitators calculated optimal firing solutions. Necron Gorse weaponry carved through bioship hulls that conventional weapons could barely scratch, while Eldar bright lances struck with surgical precision at synaptic nodes identified by captured Tyranid biological data. The Orc contribution came with typical brutal enthusiasm as Warboss Scarjaw led his Death Skulls in a massive boarding assault against a Tyranid hive ship. Yet for the first time in Orc history, their chaotic charge was coordinated by Tau battlesuit commanders, who provided real-time tactical support through comlinks grudgingly installed in Orc armor. "That's it, you gits!" Scarjaw roared, as his boys smashed through chitinous corridors. "The blue boys is telling us where the good fights are. Follow the pretty lights and kill everything that ain't green." The sight of Orcs taking direction from Tau commanders violated every military doctrine ever written, yet it proved devastatingly effective. Tau drones provided covering fire, while Orc choppers carved through Tyranid defenders, creating a form of combined arms warfare that neither species could have achieved alone. The most shocking cooperation came from an unexpected source as Dark Eldar raiders emerged from the webway to strike at Tyranid synapse creatures with surgical precision. Vekt's forces had no interest in honor or glory, only in the efficient elimination of targets that threatened their own survival. Their sudden strikes severed hive mind connections at critical moments, allowing Allied forces to exploit the resulting chaos. Yet even as the Alliance proved its potential, the true horror of the Tyranid threat became apparent. Bioships damaged by Imperial weapons began secreting new forms of armor that adapted to macro-cannon impacts. Organisms that survived Tau pulse fire developed natural shielding against energy weapons. Most disturbing of all, captured genetic material from fallen defenders was being rapidly incorporated into new Tyranid forms. The battle's turning point came when Necron technology provided a solution that no single faction could have achieved. Lord Anrakir's tomb ship projected a massive temporal displacement field that slowed time around the largest hive ship, allowing Allied forces to concentrate their fire against a target that could not adapt quickly enough to counter the assault. Imperial Guard regiments, transported through Eldar webway portals, materialized aboard the bioship's command deck in perfectly coordinated strikes. Cadian shock troops fought alongside Tau fire warriors, their combined firepower directed by Eldar rangers who identified critical synaptic nodes through millennia of experience fighting the Great Devourer. The death scream of the hive ship's synaptic core resonated through the warp as psychic feedback overwhelmed Tyranid organisms throughout the fleet. Bioships that had seemed unstoppable moments before now drifted helpless in the void, their crews severed from the hive mind's guiding intelligence. Yet victory came at a cost that sobered even the most optimistic Alliance commanders. 3 Imperial vessels had been lost to Tyranid boarding actions, their crews consumed, and their genetic material added to the hive fleet's biological database. A Tau exploration cadre had been overwhelmed while defending a damaged vessel, their sacrifice saving hundreds of Imperial lives. Most troubling were the reports from survivors who had faced the adapted Tyranid forms. The creatures had begun incorporating weapons and armor patterns from all Alliance factions, creating hybrid organisms that combined Imperial resilience with Tau technology and Eldar speed. The hive mind was learning not just from individual encounters, but from the very concept of cooperation itself. As the surviving bioships fled into the void, their genetic samples already being analyzed by the greater hive mind, the Alliance commanders gathered for their first post-battle assessment. The victory was undeniable. A Tyranid probe fleet had been defeated with casualties that would have been impossible for any single faction to achieve. Yet the ease with which the enemy adapted to their combined tactics suggested future battles would be far more challenging. "They learn from us," Shadow Sun observed, her analysis typical of Tau pragmatism. "Each engagement will be more difficult as they incorporate our cooperative tactics into their own strategies." Farsia Taldir's response came through psychic projection, her visions showing possible futures where Tyranid organisms fought with the discipline of Imperial Guard, the precision of Tau technology, and the brutal efficiency of Orc warfare. The sight was enough to unnerve even the most battle-hardened commanders. "Then we must learn faster than they can adapt," Admiral Quintanus said, his voice carrying the grim determination that had carried humanity through 10,000 years of warfare. "We have proven that unity can achieve what division cannot. Now we must evolve that unity before they evolve to counter it." The Battle of Kythera became the template for combined operations throughout the Alliance, yet it also served as a warning of the challenge they faced. The Great Devourer was not merely a force of consumption, but of adaptation, learning from every encounter and incorporating new strategies into its vast biological arsenal. As the combined fleet regrouped and prepared for the next engagement, each faction's forces carried with them the knowledge that they had achieved something unprecedented. Orcs had followed Tau tactical guidance. Imperial Guard had fought alongside Eldar Rangers. Dark Eldar had cooperated without treachery. The impossible had become merely difficult. Yet in the void beyond the galactic rim, the hive mind of Ouroboros processed the genetic and tactical data returned by Prometheus's survivors. Cooperation among prey species was interesting, but not insurmountable. Each faction's strengths were noted and catalogued. Their weaknesses were identified and exploited. Most importantly, their very unity became another variable to be incorporated into the swarm's adaptive responses. The feast would be delayed, but not denied. And when the main hive fleet finally arrived, it would bring with it weapons and strategies that had been refined by the lessons learned in the first encounter between unity and hunger. The war for the galaxy's survival had begun in earnest, and both sides were learning with each passing moment. The question that remained was whether the children of the galaxy could evolve their cooperation faster than the Great Devourer could adapt to consume it. Above Kythera, the stars burned with their ancient light, yet those who had fought beneath them knew that light was no longer eternal. In the deep void, something vast and patient prepared for the next lesson in the long education that would culminate in either salvation or consumption. Knowledge can be a crueler burden than ignorance, for it strips away the comfort of false hope and reveals the true scope of one's insignificance. In the weeks following the Battle of Kythera, the Alliance that had celebrated its first victory found itself confronting revelations that made their triumph seem not just hollow, but potentially catastrophic. The Great Devourer had not merely retreated, it had learned, adapted, and begun to incorporate the very unity that the galaxy's children had thought was their salvation. The first reports came from the Tau border worlds, where Commander Farsight's expeditionary forces encountered Tyranid bioforms unlike any previously catalogued. The creatures that emerged from the shadow of a consumed moon bore characteristics that defied biological possibility. Their chitin shells incorporated the angular efficiency of Tau armor plating. Their weapons fired projectiles that mimicked the precision of pulse rifle technology. Most disturbing of all, their movement patterns demonstrated tactical coordination that mirrored Firecast doctrine. "The enemy has learned our ways," Farsight reported to the assembled Alliance commanders, his scarred face reflecting the weight of discovery. They do not simply consume our technology, they understand it. The bioforms we faced moved with the discipline of trained warriors, not the instinct of beasts. The revelation prompted an emergency session within the fortress of Hera, where representatives of all factions gathered to share similarly disturbing intelligence. Imperial forces reported encounters with Tyranid organisms that had incorporated Astra Militarum tactical formations. Eldar rangers spoke of creatures that moved through terrain with the fluid grace of their own kind. Even Orc war bosses admitted to facing enemies that fought with a brutality that matched their own. Yet it was the Silent King who provided context that transformed concern into existential dread. Sharek stood before the assembled alliance, his ancient form projecting hololithic data that spanned millions of years. The images showed not just the current Tyranid threat, but echoes of similar consumption events that stretched back to the galaxy's youth. "You believe this to be the first time such unity has been attempted," the Silent King said, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of eons spent in contemplation. "You are wrong. Before the war in heaven, before the fall of the Eldar, before humanity drew its first breath, other civilizations faced similar threats. They too forged alliances. They too discovered cooperation in the face of extinction." The holographs shifted to show the remains of worlds that had been stripped not just of life, but of the very memory of what had lived there. Ancient structures that bore the hallmarks of multiple species working in concert, now reduced to crystalline formations that served as monuments to consumed unity. Each alliance taught the swarm new lessons in cooperation, Zarek continued. Each victory provided new templates for organization. The Great Devourer does not simply consume, it perfects. What you face now is not hunger alone, but hunger guided by the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 extinct alliances. The psychological impact of this revelation rippled through the assembled forces. Commander Shadowsun's normally steady voice carried a tremor as she spoke. "If unity has been attempted before and failed, what makes us believe we can succeed where others could not?" The answer came from an unexpected source as reports arrived from the Eye of Terror itself. Chaos forces that had expected their corruption to provide immunity from Tyranid consumption discovered that the Great Devourer had evolved beyond their understanding. Bioships emerging from warp storms no longer recoiled from chaos taint. They consumed it, digested it, and emerged purified. Abaddon's voice reached the Alliance through encrypted transmissions, his fury barely contained. The demon engines of Khorne fall before creatures that feed upon rage itself. Nurgle's plagues are absorbed and metabolized. Even Sinch's endless schemes become nothing more than genetic patterns to be catalogued and improved upon. Chaos offers no sanctuary from what comes. This intelligence forced a complete revision of defensive strategies. If corruption could not deter the Tyranids, and unity only provided them with new templates for organization, what weapons remained to the galaxy's defenders? The answer emerged from the most unlikely source: the careful analysis of scout fleet movements by Imperial intelligence, augmented by Tau drone surveillance and Eldar farsight. Magos biologist Kaul, speaking from his laboratories on Mars, provided data that painted a picture of patient, methodical preparation spanning millennia. The bioships we have designated as scout fleets were not random probes, his mechanized voice intoned. They were cartographers. Every Tyranid incursion has been mapping not just our military capabilities, but our social structures, our alliance patterns, our methods of cooperation. The tactical displays that accompanied his report showed Tyranid infiltration extending back thousands of years. Genestealer cults that had been discovered and purged had transmitted data before their destruction. Consumed worlds had provided not just biomass, but detailed intelligence about how different species interacted under stress. Most chilling was the realization that the Tyranids had been studying the concept of alliance itself. Each previous cooperation between species, from desperate last stands to temporary truces, had been observed, catalogued, and incorporated into the hive mind's vast database of strategic knowledge. "They know us better than we know ourselves," Eldrad observed, his ancient eyes reflecting visions of possible futures that grew darker with each passing moment. "They have mapped not just our strengths and weaknesses, but the very psychology that drives us to unite in the face of extinction." The emergency session that followed lasted for days as Alliance strategists attempted to develop new doctrines that could counter an enemy that had spent millennia preparing for their cooperation. Traditional military wisdom proved inadequate when facing an enemy that had already adapted to every conceivable form of unity. It was during this strategic deadlock that long-range sensors detected the true scope of what approached from dark space. The readings came first from Necron tomb ships positioned at the galaxy's edge, their ancient instruments capable of penetrating the void between stars. What they revealed defied comprehension, even by beings who had existed for millions of years. Hive Fleet Ouroboros was not simply larger than previous invasions, it was qualitatively different. The bioships that comprised its vanguard elements were the size of small moons, their hulls incorporating not just biological matter but stellar debris and planetary fragments. These were not ships, but mobile ecosystems, capable of supporting populations that numbered in the trillions. "The main hive fleet contains organisms we cannot properly classify," reported Cryptek Ankh Efenkonsu, his voice carrying the strain of processing data that challenged even Necron computational matrices. Bioships that appear to be consuming dark matter itself for sustenance. Creatures that exist partially outside normal space-time. The swarm approaches not as an invasion force, but as a migrating galaxy unto itself. The revelation transformed the Alliance's understanding of their situation. They were not facing a military threat that could be defeated through conventional warfare. They confronted a force of nature that had been perfected through the consumption of countless civilizations, each adding their own innovations to an ever-growing arsenal of biological and strategic capabilities. Yet rather than despair, this knowledge forged the Alliance into something stronger than mere cooperation. The representatives of species that had warred for millennia found themselves united, not just by necessity, but by the profound humility that came from understanding their place in a cosmic pattern of resistance and consumption. "Then we must become something unprecedented," Guilliman said, his voice carrying the authority of one who had helped forge an empire that spanned the stars. Not merely an alliance, but a synthesis. We must evolve beyond what any single species could achieve, beyond what previous alliances have attempted. The Silent King's response carried approval that transcended species boundaries. Unity forged in desperation becomes something greater when tempered by knowledge of its true cost. Perhaps what approaches from the void will find not scattered prey or familiar alliance patterns, but something genuinely new in the galaxy's history. As the Alliance prepared for the true test that awaited them, each faction began to understand that survival would require transformation at the most fundamental level. The coming war would not be won through superior firepower or tactical brilliance alone, but through becoming something that had never existed before, a truly unified galactic civilization. In the void beyond the galaxy's edge, the hive mind of Ouroboros processed the intelligence returned by its scout organisms with something approaching satisfaction. The alliance forming in response to its approach was indeed unprecedented in its scope and cooperation. This would make the eventual consumption all the more instructive. Each previous alliance had provided valuable lessons in the psychology of desperate cooperation. This galaxy's attempt at unity promised to add new dimensions to the hive mind's understanding of how sentient species responded to existential threats. The data gathered would prove invaluable when the swarm eventually encountered the next galaxy in its endless migration. The feast was delayed, but not denied, and when it finally began, the Great Devourer would be armed with the accumulated wisdom of every civilization that had ever dared to stand united against the infinite hunger of the void. Engineering is the art of imposing order upon chaos, yet what the galaxy's children attempted in the wake of their revelations challenged every principle of construction and cooperation ever conceived. The Iron Ring, as it came to be known, was not merely a defensive network, but a testament to the impossible. A structure that spanned light years, incorporating technologies from species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of destroying each other's creations. The construction began at the galaxy's edge, where Necron tomb fleets emerged from crypts that had slumbered since the war in heaven. Ancient pylons, their black surfaces inscribed with equations that predated humanity's first glimpse of the stars, rose from worlds that had been barren for millions of years. Yet these were not the simple null field generators of old, but hybrid constructs that defied every law of physics and politics alike. Tecdominus Col stood upon the surface of the forge world Lucius, watching as Tau Earthcast engineers worked alongside his most skilled tech adepts to integrate shield generator matrices with Imperial Void Shield technology. The site violated every tenet of the Omnissiah's teachings, yet the Archmagos found himself fascinated by the elegant efficiency of Xenos engineering principles applied to Imperial sacred designs. The harmonic frequencies must be precisely calibrated, observed Chazelle Mien, her voice carrying the calm precision that marked the finest of Earthcast engineers. Imperial void shields operate on brute force principles, while our shield generators rely on deflection matrices. The synthesis requires abandoning the doctrinal purity of both approaches. The Tau engineer's words would have been heresy under any other circumstances, yet necessity had transformed sacrilege into salvation. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out as ancient enemies worked side by side to create defensive installations that combined the best of all their technologies. On the death world of Mordian, Orc mechs labored alongside Tau drones to construct massive gun batteries that incorporated both species' approaches to warfare. Where Tau engineering favored precision and efficiency, Orc cunning brought an intuitive understanding of how to make impossibly large weapons function through sheer bloody-mindedness. The resulting installations defied every principle of engineering design, yet somehow managed to function with devastating effectiveness. Big Mech Scarjaw stood before a plasma cannon the size of a Hab block, its barrel a hybrid of Tau pulse technology and Orc scrap metal welding that should have exploded the moment it was activated. Instead, it had achieved targeting accuracy that rivaled Imperial macro cannons while maintaining the devastating power output that only Orc engineering could produce. "The blue boys know how to make things work proper-like," Scarjaw admitted grudgingly, "but they don't know how to make 'em work when they shouldn't. That's where we's come in." The most challenging integration came not from technological differences, but from philosophical ones, as Space Marine chapters found themselves coordinating with Chaos Space Marine warbands in defense installations that both factions would normally die rather than share. The Iron Hands worked alongside the Iron Warriors, their bitter rivalry set aside in the face of extinction. The Imperial Fists constructed fortifications that were enhanced by the siege expertise of Perturabo's sons. Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists stood upon the battlements of a fortress that incorporated both loyalist and traitor architectural principles. The walls bore the geometric precision that his chapter had perfected over 10 millennia, yet they were enhanced by defensive designs that could only have come from 10,000 years of bitter siege warfare. "They fight without honor," Lysander observed to Warsmith Honso, his voice heavy with the weight of compromises that would have been unthinkable days before. "Yet they understand fortification as we do. Perhaps there is wisdom in learning from those we despise." The Chaos Space Marine's response carried a bitter humor that spoke of wars fought across the Eye of Terror's endless battlefields. "Honor is a luxury for those who expect to survive, Loyalist. We learned long ago that victory requires using every weapon available, even cooperation with those who would see us damned." The Eldar contribution to the Iron Ring came through the manipulation of the webway itself, as Farseers worked with their Dark Eldar cousins to create dimensional gateways that could transport reinforcements across vast distances instantaneously. The cooperation between Craftworld and Comorite was perhaps the most unlikely of all, as beings who had defined themselves through opposing philosophies found common ground in survival. Farseer Eldrad stood within a webway junction that had been expanded beyond its original design, its crystalline passages now large enough to accommodate Imperial Titans and Tau battlesuits. Beside him, Archon Vecht supervised the installation of dimensional anchors that would prevent the passages from collapsing under the strain of massive troop movements. "Your people's restraint has always puzzled me," Vecht said, his voice carrying the silk-wrapped poison that marked all Dark Eldar speech. "Yet I begin to understand its value. Discipline in service of a greater goal rather than immediate gratification." How wonderfully perverse. Eldrad's response carried the weight of prophecy and bitter experience. "And your people's ruthless efficiency serves us now, cousin. Perhaps in unity, both our paths find validation they could never achieve in isolation." The construction of the Iron Ring required not just technological integration, but logistical coordination on a scale that defied comprehension. Imperial Navy vessels worked alongside Tau exploration fleets to transport materials across sectors. Necron tomb ships phased through space to deliver pylons to worlds that had never seen their like. Even Orc rocks contributed to the effort, their crude but effective cargo capacity proving essential for moving the massive quantities of raw materials required. Yet it was the human cost of the project that tested the Alliance most severely. Billions of workers from dozens of species labored under conditions that pushed the boundaries of what any being could endure. Imperial Guard regiments worked alongside Tau Fire warriors, their genetic animosity set aside in the face of shared exhaustion. Eldar artisans collaborated with human tech adepts, their aesthetic sensibilities clashing but ultimately harmonizing in designs that neither could have achieved alone. The casualties mounted as construction accidents, equipment failures, and the sheer scale of the project took their toll. An Imperial construction team was lost when a Necron temporal field malfunctioned, aging them to dust in moments. Tau workers died when an Orc weapon test went catastrophically wrong. Eldar craftsmen sacrificed themselves to stabilize a webway junction that threatened to collapse and take half a system with it. Each death was mourned not just by the fallen being's own species, but by all who worked alongside them. Imperial chaplains conducted funeral rites for Tau workers. Earthcast engineers honored fallen Imperial Guard with ceremonies adapted from their own traditions. The shared grief became a bond that transcended species barriers, creating a unity that was deeper than mere cooperation. As the months passed and the Iron Ring neared completion, its true scope became apparent to all who had labored to create it. Defensive installations that spanned multiple star systems, connected by webway gates that could transport entire armies in moments. Shield matrices that combined the best of all faction technologies, creating barriers that could withstand assaults that would have shattered any single species' defensive network. The centerpiece of the ring was the fortress station, designated Eternal Vigilance, constructed at the junction of multiple webway passages and defended by pylons that created null fields capable of disrupting even the largest Tyranid bioships. The station itself was a marvel of cooperative engineering, incorporating Imperial Gothic architecture with Tau efficiency, Necron durability, and Eldar elegance. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels found himself assigned as the station's primary Imperial liaison, working alongside representatives from all factions to coordinate what had become the largest military installation in galactic history. The ancient space marine stood upon the command deck, watching through massive viewing ports as ships from across the galaxy took their positions within the defensive grid. "Never did I imagine I would see such unity," Dante said to his assembled counterparts. Emporium and Xenos, loyalist and traitor, all working toward the same goal. Perhaps there is hope yet that we might survive what comes. The Silent King's response carried the weight of millions of years spent in contemplation of survival and extinction. "Hope is a luxury that the living possess, Commander. Yet even we who have passed beyond such emotions recognize the value of what has been achieved here. The Iron Ring is not merely a defensive network, it is proof that unity can create wonders that no single faction could achieve." As the final components of the ring came online, long-range sensors began detecting the approach of Hive Fleet Ouroboros's vanguard elements. The bioships that emerged from the void between galaxies were larger than anything previously encountered, their hulls incorporating matter from consumed stars and the debris of entire systems. Yet for the first time since the threat had been identified, the galaxy's defenders felt something approaching confidence. The Iron Ring represented more than defensive capability. It was proof that the impossible could become merely difficult when necessity drove ancient enemies to set aside their hatred. Each pylon, each shield generator, each weapons platform bore the mark of cooperation between species that had defined themselves through mutual destruction. Yet as the defenders prepared for the first test of their creation, each faction's representatives understood that the true challenge lay not in the technology they had built, but in maintaining the unity that had made its construction possible. The Great Devourer was coming, and it would test not just their defensive capabilities, but the very bonds that held their alliance together. In the void beyond the galaxy's edge, the hive mind observed the construction of the Iron Ring with something approaching approval. Unity among prey species often manifested in defensive installations, and each previous example had provided valuable lessons in the limits of cooperative effort. The approaching bioships carried within their genetic memory banks the experiences of consuming dozens of similar defensive networks. This galaxy's attempt was impressive in its scope and technological sophistication, yet the fundamental principles remained the same. Unity required constant effort to maintain, while hunger was eternal. The ring would be tested, analyzed, and eventually overcome, adding its innovations to the swarm's vast catalogue of defensive strategies to be countered. The feast was delayed, but not denied. And when the Iron Ring finally fell, its lessons would make the next galaxy's defensive efforts all the easier to digest. There are moments when the universe reveals its true scale, stripping away the comfortable illusions that allow mortals to function in the face of infinity. When Hive Fleet Ouroboros finally reached the galaxy's edge, Those who witnessed its approach understood that they had spent their lives as insects contemplating the ocean. The swarm that emerged from the void between stars was not merely large, it was a living galaxy unto itself, a migration of hunger that dwarfed every previous conception of what the Tyranids represented. The first indication came not from sensors, but from the stars themselves going dark. Entire constellations vanished behind a tide of bioships that stretched across light years, their hulls blocking the ancient light of distant suns. Long-range augers struggled to process readings that defied comprehension. Bioships the size of moons moved in formations that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Escort organisms that individually matched Imperial battleships in mass swarmed around massive hive ships like insects around corpses. From the command center of eternal vigilance, Commander Dante watched the tactical displays with the expression of one who had lived for over 1,000 years, yet had never imagined such a sight. The ancient Blood Angel stood surrounded by representatives from every faction of the Alliance. Their combined expertise focused on analyzing an enemy that challenged every tactical doctrine ever devised. The scale exceeds our most pessimistic projections by orders of magnitude, reported Magos biologist Carl, his mechanized voice carrying harmonics that betrayed strain even in his augmented emotional responses. Individual bioships are registering as larger than Imperial battleships. The escort formations alone outnumber our entire defensive fleet. The Silent King's presence cast shadows that seemed to bend reality itself as he processed data through quantum calculations that spanned dimensions. "This is not the entirety of their force," Zarek observed, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic perspective. "What we observe is merely the forward elements. The main swarm remains in the void beyond our sensor range, awaiting the outcome of this initial probe." Commander Shadowsun's battlesuit integrated directly with the station's targeting matrices, her consciousness merging with Tau technology in ways that allowed her to process the approaching threat with mathematical precision. If this is merely a probe, then our defensive calculations are meaningless. We are not facing an invasion force, but a cosmic phenomenon. The first test of the Iron Ring came as bioship formations reached the outer defensive perimeter, where Necron pylons had been anchored to asteroids and dead worlds throughout the galaxy's rim. The null field generators that had once been simple weapons of war now served as the foundation for a defensive network that spanned multiple star systems, their effects amplified by Tau shield technology and Imperial void shield matrices. The initial contact was almost anticlimactic. Bioships that approached the pylon fields simply ceased to function, their organic systems disrupted by null field effects that prevented the hive mind from maintaining control over distant organisms. Entire formations drifted helplessly in space, their biohulls intact, but their crews severed from the synaptic networks that gave them purpose. Yet the celebration was premature, for what followed demonstrated the true horror of Tyranid adaptability. The bioships that had been disabled by the null fields began to undergo rapid biological changes. Their hulls sprouted new organs that pulsed with bioelectrical energy. Symbiotic organisms emerged from their interiors, creatures specifically adapted to function independently of hive mind control. "They are adapting in real time," observed Farsia Taldir, her consciousness touching the flows of possibility that surrounded the battle. "Each disabled bioship becomes a laboratory for developing countermeasures to our defenses. We have not created a barrier. We have provided them with a training ground." The breakthrough came not through technological adaptation, but through sheer numbers. For every bioship disabled by the null fields, a dozen more pressed forward, their hulls now bearing organisms that fed on the very energies meant to stop them. The Iron Ring's defenses, magnificent as they were, could not process targets that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The first penetration occurred at Sector Tertius, where a swarm of bioships, too numerous to target individually, overwhelmed the defensive stations through mass assault. Weapons batteries that had been designed to destroy individual vessels found themselves facing clouds of organisms that absorbed their fire and converted it into biomass for further reproduction. Captain Uriel Ventris of the Ultramarines led the first boarding action against a hive ship that had breached the outer perimeter. His strike force consisted of space marines from a dozen different chapters, Tau Fire Warriors, and even Chaos Space Marines from the Iron Warriors, their ancient rivalry set aside in the face of extinction. The interior of the bioship defied every tactical manual ever written. Corridors that pulsed with organic life, weapons that grew from the walls themselves, defenders that adapted their tactics with each engagement, learning from fallen comrades to counter the boarding party's strategies. "The ship is alive," Ventris reported, through Vox links that struggled to penetrate the bioship's interference. Not merely inhabited, alive. The corridors reorganize themselves to channel us toward ambush points. The very air seeks to consume us. The boarding action became a nightmare of biological horror, as Tyranid organisms revealed new forms that had been specifically adapted to counter-alliance tactics. Creatures that moved with the speed and grace of Eldar warriors, bioweapons that fired with the precision of Tau pulse rifles, defensive formations that demonstrated the tactical discipline of Imperial Guard regiments. Yet it was the sacrifice of Captain Thessarius of the Lamenters that provided the breakthrough the Alliance needed. The Space Marine detonated his own plasma reactor within the bioship's synaptic core, severing its connection to the hive mind and causing the massive vessel to drift helpless in the void. His final transmission carried across the battle. For the Emperor, and for all who would see tomorrow's light, the tactic was immediately adopted by boarding parties across the Iron Ring, as heroes from every faction sacrificed themselves to sever synaptic connections and disable the massive bioships. Commander Puretide of the Tau led a fire warrior cadre in a desperate assault on a hive ship's command node. Captain Cardan Stronos of the Iron Hands merged with the bioship's organic systems, using his own mechanical augmentations to disrupt its biological processes from within. Even Chaos Space Marines found honor in sacrifice, as Warsmith Honso detonated a cyclonic torpedo within a bioship's breeding chamber, preventing the creation of new organisms while ending his own existence in fire that cleansed rather than corrupted. The losses mounted with each passing hour. Entire defensive stations were consumed, their crews adding their biomass to the ever-growing Tyranid forces. Imperial Navy battleships were overwhelmed by boarding actions that saw their corridors transformed into breeding grounds for new organisms. Tau exploration fleets vanished into bioship hulls that digested their advanced technology and incorporated it into new weapons systems. Yet for every loss, the Alliance learned new lessons about their enemy and themselves. Eldar Rangers guided Imperial Guard through webway passages that allowed them to strike at bioships from unexpected angles. Necron overlords shared their immortal perspective with mortal commanders, helping them see beyond immediate tactical concerns to the longer strategic implications. The Dark Eldar contribution proved crucial, as Archon Vect's raiders demonstrated that the bioships, for all their adaptive capabilities, remained vulnerable to attacks that targeted their dimensional stability. Raids through the webway allowed Dark Eldar forces to strike at synaptic nodes from angles that the Tyranids could not predict or counter. As the first phase of the battle concluded, the Alliance had achieved something unprecedented. They had held the Iron Ring against an enemy that had consumed galaxies. Yet the cost had been terrible. Billions of defenders had died in the opening engagements. Entire defensive installations had been consumed or destroyed. The outer ring of pylons had been overrun, forcing a consolidation to secondary defensive positions. Commander Dante stood before the surviving Alliance leaders, his ancient face bearing the weight of losses that would have broken lesser beings. "We have proven that the Iron Ring can hold against their initial assault," he said, his voice carrying both pride and sorrow. "Yet what we face is not an enemy that can be defeated through conventional warfare. Each engagement teaches them new ways to counter our defenses." The Silent King's response carried the wisdom of millions of years spent contemplating the nature of war and survival. Then we must become something they have never encountered before, an enemy that learns faster than they can adapt. Unity is not enough. We must achieve synthesis, becoming something greater than the sum of our parts. As the Alliance prepared for the next phase of the battle, each faction's survivors carried with them the knowledge that they had achieved the impossible. They had held the line against the Great Devourer. Yet they also understood that the enemy they faced was unlike anything the galaxy had ever confronted. The bioships that had been repelled were already incorporating the lessons of defeat into new strategies. Above them, the stars that had been hidden behind the swarm began to reappear as the Tyranids consolidated their forces for the next assault. Yet the light seemed different now, touched by the knowledge that it might soon be extinguished forever. The Iron Ring had held, but barely, and what approached from the deeper void would test the Alliance's unity in ways that mere cooperation could not address. In the depths of space, the hive mind processed the data returned by its probe organisms with something approaching satisfaction. The defensive network was impressive in its scope and technological integration, yet it had revealed crucial weaknesses in the Alliance's unity. The next assault would exploit those weaknesses, turning the defenders' very cooperation against them. The feast was no longer merely delayed, it had begun. Each fallen defender added their genetic patterns to the swarm's vast database. Each destroyed bioship provided lessons in how to better counter the defensive network. The galaxy's children had proven their determination to survive. But determination alone would not be enough against hunger that had been perfected across countless worlds. The Great Devourer had tasted unity, and found it merely another flavor to be savored and consumed. War has its own geography, carving sacred and damned ground from worlds that once knew peace. In the wake of the Iron Ring's first test, the Alliance discovered that survival would not be determined by grand gestures or single decisive battles, but by their ability to hold individual worlds against an enemy that adapted with each engagement. Across the galaxy, planets that had been mere coordinates on strategic maps became crucibles where unity would be forged in fire or shattered beneath the weight of infinite hunger. The rebuilt fortress world of Cadia Prime stood once more as the galaxy's gate, its purple skies scarred by orbital bombardments that had been repelled through cooperation that would have been unthinkable before the Alliance. The world that had once stood alone against the forces of chaos now hosted regiments that defied every military tradition ever written. Cadian shock troops fought alongside fire warriors of the Toe Empire, their combined firepower directed by tactical doctrines that merged imperial discipline with Xenos precision. General Creed, his weathered face bearing scars from a dozen campaigns, stood upon the battlements of Khazar Kraf alongside Commander Brightsword of the Toe Fourth Sphere. Below them, mixed formations of Imperial Guard and Fire Warriors held defensive positions that incorporated both species' understanding of fortification and field tactics. Your people's approach to cover and fire lanes is efficient, Creed admitted, his voice carrying the grudging respect of a veteran who had learned to value results over doctrine. Though I still say a good lasgun beats a pulse rifle when you're down to the last shot. Brightsword's response carried the calm assurance that marked the finest TOW commanders. Efficiency serves the greater good, General. Yet I have observed that your guardsmen possess a determination that transcends mere tactical doctrine. Perhaps there is wisdom in combining both approaches. The Tyranid assault on Cadia came not as a single overwhelming force, but as a series of probing attacks that tested every aspect of the combined defenses. Bioships dropped spores that released organisms specifically adapted to counter-alliance tactics, creatures that moved with TOW mobility while striking with Imperial ferocity, swarms that demonstrated Cadian tactical discipline while incorporating Xenos adaptive capabilities. Yet the defenders had evolved as well. Imperial artillery batteries, guided by TOW marker lights, achieved accuracy that neither species could have managed alone. Fire Warrior rapid strike teams supported by Cadian heavy weapons created killing fields that channeled the Tyranid assault into prepared positions. The planet that had once held through stubborn resistance now endured through cooperative excellence. 3 systems spinward, the agricultural worlds of Ultramar faced a different but equally crucial test. Calth, Iax, and Talasar had been transformed into vast farming complexes that fed not just Imperial forces, but TOW colonies, Eldar craft worlds, and even Orc enclaves that had joined the Alliance. The loss of these worlds would starve the combined fleets within months. Chapter Master Calgar of the Ultramarines coordinated the defense from orbit, his strike cruiser working alongside vessels from every faction to maintain supply lines that stretched across multiple sectors. The sight of Space Marines fighting to protect TOW agricultural drones would have been heretical months before. Now it was simply necessary. The enemy understands the strategic value of our supply lines, Calgar reported to the Alliance Command. Their assault patterns target food production facilities rather than military installations. They seek to starve us into surrender rather than defeat us through direct engagement. The defense of Talasar became a masterpiece of multi-species cooperation as ultramarine devastators provided heavy weapons support for Tiao Earth-caste engineers working to evacuate grain stores. Eldar Rangers used their mobility to strike at Tyranid organisms that threatened the agricultural infrastructure, while Orc Storm Boys provided air support that was crude but devastatingly effective. Yet it was on the maiden world of Lilith's Garden that the Alliance faced its most psychologically challenging test. Bieltan Eldar, who had spent millennia purging worlds of human presence, found themselves fighting alongside death corps of Krieg regiments in holding actions that required both species to embrace tactics that violated their fundamental nature. Autarch Uriel stood in trenches that had been dug by human hands, watching Krieg guardsmen advance into Tyranid fire with the same selfless determination that had once marked Eldar Ghostwalker squads. The sight stirred emotions in the ancient warrior that he had thought long buried. "Your soldiers fight as if death holds no meaning for them," Iriel observed to Colonel Jerton of the Death Corps, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and confusion. "Yet they are mortal. They possess only one life to sacrifice." The colonel's response came through the respirator that marked all Krieg officers, his voice mechanically distorted, but carrying absolute conviction. Every life given in service to the Emperor and this alliance purchases time for others to live. Our deaths have meaning because they preserve what we protect. The Eldar learned from human sacrifice, while the humans gained insight from Eldar tactical mobility. Krieg troopers began incorporating Eldar hit-and-run tactics into their assault doctrines, while Bieltan warriors learned the value of holding ground regardless of cost. The world that had been saved from human colonization now survived through human sacrifice willingly given. The Tau-sept worlds presented a different model of cooperation, demonstrating how multi-species integration could function not just in crisis, but as a sustainable model for civilization. Dalith, Ores Tashvar, and Tau itself became showcases for what the galaxy might become if the Alliance survived the Tyranid threat. Ethereal Onshu stood within the command center of Dalith's primary hive city, coordinating defensive efforts that included not just Tau forces, but human auxiliaries, Eldar advisors, and even reformed Orc clans that had embraced the greater good through their own crude understanding of collective survival. The enemy seeks to turn our diversity against us, Onshu observed to his mixed-species staff. They adapt their organisms to exploit the differences between our species. Yet our unity is not uniformity, it is synthesis. Where they see weakness in our differences, we create strength through cooperation. The defense of the Tau worlds became a laboratory for alliance tactics that would be adopted across the galaxy. Human Imperial Guard provided the disciplined backbone for defensive lines, while Tau technology created force multipliers that enhanced the effectiveness of all allied units. Eldar advisors offered strategic insight that helped coordinate operations across multiple theaters, while Orc ingenuity produced solutions to tactical problems that conventional doctrine could not address. Yet it was the awakening of the Necron tomb worlds that provided the Alliance with resources they had not dared hope for. Silent King's dynasty worlds, dormant for millions of years, began to stir as ancient protocols activated in response to the Tyranid threat. Worlds that had been barren rock revealed themselves to be massive military installations, their surfaces concealing weapons systems and warrior crypts that predated the rise of humanity. Overlord Anrakir emerged from the tomb world of Pyria with legions that had slumbered since the War in Heaven, their Gorse weaponry and quantum shielding adding capabilities to the Alliance that no other faction could provide. Yet even the immortal Necrons found themselves changed by cooperation with mortal species. We who have existed beyond death learn the value of life through those who possess it, so briefly, Anrakir observed to his fellow overlords. Perhaps there is wisdom in their mortality that our immortality has forgotten. The Necron contribution proved crucial as their temporal manipulation technologies allowed Alliance forces to coordinate attacks across vast distances with precision that defied conventional physics. Webway gates anchored by Necron pylons created supply lines that could not be intercepted. Gauss weapons provided the only reliable means of permanently destroying Tyranid bioships before they could regenerate. Across these crucible worlds, the Alliance discovered that unity was not a destination, but a continuous process of adaptation and sacrifice. Each world saved required heroes to remain behind, holding positions that could not be abandoned without losing the wider strategic picture. Each victory demanded choices about which populations could be evacuated and which must remain to maintain essential facilities. The human cost of this expanded war mounted with each passing day. Entire regiments were consumed while buying time for civilian evacuations. Space Marine companies made last stands that allowed agricultural worlds to complete their harvests. Eldar aspect warriors embraced certain death to preserve webway junctions that were essential for Alliance communications. Yet these sacrifices were not meaningless gestures, but investments in a future that seemed increasingly possible as the Alliance learned to function as a truly integrated force. Mixed formations that had been desperate expedients became tactical innovations that were adopted across all theaters. Cultural exchanges that had begun through necessity evolved into genuine understanding between species. The Crucible Worlds taught the Alliance that victory wouldn't come through preserving the galaxy as it had been, but through creating something new from the fusion of all its peoples. The worlds they saved were no longer purely human, To, Eldar, or any single species domain, but hybrid societies that demonstrated what galactic civilization might become. As reports reached the Alliance Command from all theaters, a pattern emerged that had not been visible during the desperate early stages of the war. The Tyranids were not simply adapting to counter-alliance tactics, they were learning from alliance cooperation itself. Bioorganisms were beginning to demonstrate not just individual adaptive responses, but coordinated strategic thinking that mirrored the Alliance's own command structures. Commander Dante stood before the holographic displays that showed the status of Crucible worlds across the galaxy, his ancient features reflecting both pride in what had been achieved and apprehension about what was still to come. "We have proven that unity can preserve worlds that would have fallen to individual faction defense," he said to the assembled Alliance leadership. "Yet our very success teaches the enemy new ways to consume us." The Silent King's response carried the weight of cosmic perspective and hard-won wisdom. "Then we must continue to evolve faster than they can adapt. The Crucible worlds have shown us what we might become. Now we must discover if we can become it quickly enough to survive what approaches from the deeper void." The Alliance had held the line across dozens of worlds, each victory built upon sacrifices that bound the surviving defenders closer together. Yet in the depths of space beyond the galaxy's edge, the true bulk of Hive Fleet Ouroboros continued its approach, incorporating the lessons learned from each engagement into strategies that would test unity in ways that even the Crucible worlds had not imagined. The war for the galaxy's soul continued, and both sides were learning with each passing moment. The question that remained was whether the children of the galaxy could evolve their cooperation into true synthesis before the Great Devourer arrived with weapons specifically designed to consume unity itself. Above the Crucible worlds, the stars burned with light that seemed somehow different now, touched by the knowledge that each photon might bear witness to the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history, or its final, desperate extinction. The greatest horror is not the unknown, but the familiar turned against itself, transformed into something that wears the face of salvation while harboring the heart of destruction. As the Alliance celebrated their victories across the Crucible worlds, reports began arriving that transformed triumph into terror. The enemy they faced was no longer simply adapting to their tactics. It was becoming them, incorporating not just their technologies and strategies, but the very essence of what made their unity possible. The first indication came from the Cadian front, where General Creed's mixed formations encountered Tyranid bioforms that moved with unprecedented coordination. These were not the reactive swarms that had characterized previous engagements, but organized formations that demonstrated tactical discipline rivaling the finest Imperial regiments. Worse still, they incorporated technological signatures from every faction of the Alliance. Creatures that bore chitinous armor plating, configured in the angular efficiency of Tau design, fired weapons that combined the penetrating power of Imperial lasguns with the precision of pulse rifle technology. Their movement patterns demonstrated the fluid grace of Eldar warfare doctrine, while maintaining the stubborn resilience that characterized human defensive tactics. Most disturbing of all, they responded to battlefield changes with the adaptive cunning that marked the finest Orc strategists. "They fight like us," Creed reported to the Alliance command, his weathered voice carrying a tremor that spoke of fears deeper than mere tactical concern. "Not mimicking our individual approaches, but synthesizing them into something that incorporates the best of all our doctrines. They have learned not just our weapons and tactics, but our methods of cooperation itself. The revelation prompted an emergency session of the Alliance leadership, hastily convened through webway gates that connected battlefields across the galaxy. As reports flooded in from all theaters, a pattern emerged that challenged everything the Alliance had believed about the nature of their enemy. Commander Shadowson's forces on the Tau border worlds had encountered bioships that demonstrated fire and movement tactics identical to her own hunter cadres, yet enhanced by biological capabilities that no mechanical technology could match. The creatures moved through terrain with tow efficiency while striking with imperial ferocity, their attacks coordinated through bioelectrical networks that functioned like enhanced command and control systems. From Ultramar came reports that chilled even the most veteran Space Marine commanders. Chapter Master Calgar described bioforms that fought in formations that mirrored Astartes' Battle Brother squads, their movements demonstrating the same mutual support and tactical flexibility that had made the Space Marines the Emperor's finest warriors. Yet these creatures were not mere copies. They were improvements, incorporating the best elements of Space Marine doctrine while adding biological enhancements that no human warrior could possess. The Eldar contributions to the Alliance had also been absorbed and perfected. Autarch Iriel reported encountering organisms that moved through the webway itself, their bioforms adapted to navigate dimensional space with an ease that rivaled the most experienced Eldar rangers. They struck from unexpected angles and withdrew before effective counterattacks could be launched, yet they did so with a coordination that suggested hive mind control rather than individual initiative. Yet it was the emergence of a new form of Tyranid leadership that truly demonstrated the scope of the threat the Alliance now faced. Intelligence reports from multiple theaters described encounters with a creature that defied every previous classification of Tyranid hierarchy. The being that Alliance forces designated as the Swarm Lord Synthesis was not merely a larger version of previous Synapse creatures, but something that demonstrated strategic thinking that matched the finest commanders the galaxy had ever produced. The entity appeared simultaneously across multiple battlefields, its consciousness distributed through the hive mind's vast neural network, yet maintaining individual identity and strategic coherence. It commanded biofleets with tactical acumen that incorporated the strategic doctrines of every Alliance faction, coordinating assaults that demonstrated understanding of supply lines, morale factors, and long-term strategic objectives. Magos Biologist Cowell's analysis of captured biomatter revealed the mechanism behind this terrifying development. The organisms are not simply incorporating our technologies, he reported through mechanical Vox transmitters that struggled to convey the magnitude of his discovery. They are incorporating the psychic imprints of fallen Alliance warriors. Every death, every sacrifice, every moment of cooperation has been catalogued and absorbed into their genetic matrix. The revelation struck the Alliance leadership like a physical blow. The Silent King's ancient consciousness processed implications that spanned millions of years of warfare and survival. They have weaponized our unity against us, Sarek said, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of cosmic despair. Every moment of cooperation, every tactical innovation born from our alliance, becomes a template for them to perfect and deploy against us. Eldrad's response came through psychic projection that allowed all present to share his visions of possible futures. The Farseer showed them battlefields where Tyranid organisms fought with perfect coordination, their movements demonstrating not just tactical efficiency, but genuine strategic creativity. They adapted to changing conditions, not through biological evolution, but through learned tactical innovation. The threads of fate show us facing an enemy that understands war as we understand it, Eldrad said, his ancient voice heavy with the weight of prophecy. They have learned not just our individual strengths, but the synergies that emerge from our cooperation. We face ourselves, perfected, and turned to our destruction. The psychological impact of this revelation rippled through alliance forces across the galaxy. Soldiers who had learned to fight alongside their former enemies now faced creatures that fought with their own tactical doctrines, enhanced by biological capabilities that made traditional countermeasures ineffective. The enemy had stolen not just their weapons and strategies, but their very identity as warriors. Commander Dante stood before the assembled leadership, his ancient features reflecting the weight of a burden that had grown beyond mere military command. If they can incorporate our cooperation into their biological matrix, then conventional unity becomes a weapon they can turn against us, he said. Every tactic we develop, every innovation born from our alliance, becomes ammunition for their adaptive arsenal. The crisis deepened as reports arrived of bioforms that demonstrated not just tactical cooperation, but strategic creativity that matched the Alliance's finest minds. Creatures that established supply lines and logistics networks that functioned with efficiency that rivaled Tau organizational doctrine. Organisms that demonstrated the kind of inspirational leadership that had made human Imperial Guard commanders legendary for their ability to maintain morale under impossible conditions. Most chilling were the encounters with bioforms that demonstrated what could only be described as honor, creatures that fought according to codes of conduct that mirrored Space Marine battle doctrine, yet served the Great Devourer's hunger with unwavering dedication. They had absorbed not just the Alliance's tactical capabilities, but the warrior ethos that made those tactics effective. The Swarm Lord synthesis proved this point through a series of coordinated assaults that demonstrated strategic thinking that incorporated elements from every Alliance faction's command doctrine. It established kill zones with Imperial efficiency, executed flanking maneuvers with Eldar grace, and maintained supply lines with Tau precision, all while coordinating through hive mind networks that allowed for battlefield adaptation that no single species command structure could match. The Alliance's greatest strength had become their most dangerous vulnerability. Every successful cooperation, every tactical innovation, born from their unity, was absorbed and perfected by an enemy that learned not through trial and error, but through consumption of the Alliance's own experiences. Yet in this darkest revelation, the seeds of transformation began to emerge. The Silent King's analysis of the threat led to a conclusion that challenged every assumption about the nature of war and cooperation that had guided the Alliance thus far. They can absorb our cooperation because they understand it as another biological function to be catalogued and replicated, Zarek observed. Yet they cannot truly comprehend what lies beyond cooperation, the synthesis of consciousness that transcends individual identity, while preserving the essence that makes each faction unique. Guilliman's response carried the authority of one who had spent 10,000 years learning to see beyond immediate tactical concerns. "You speak of symbiosis," he said. "Not mere coordination of effort, but genuine unity of purpose that goes beyond what any individual faction could achieve, something that has never existed in galactic history." The revelation forced the Alliance to confront a truth that none had wanted to acknowledge. Cooperation alone would not be sufficient to defeat an enemy that could absorb and perfect every form of tactical unity they demonstrated. Victory would require transformation at the most fundamental level, not just working together, but becoming something genuinely new. Farseer Eldrad's visions showed glimpses of what such transformation might look like. Consciousness shared across species barriers without loss of individual identity. Tactical innovation that emerged not from the combination of existing doctrines, but from genuinely new forms of strategic thinking. Unity that transcended mere cooperation to become something that had never existed before in the galaxy's history. The path forward required abandoning everything the Alliance thought they understood about the nature of war and cooperation. They would have to become something unprecedented, not a collection of species working together, but a genuine synthesis that created capabilities no individual faction could imagine. As the Alliance prepared for what would surely be their final test, each faction's representatives understood that survival would require sacrificing not just individual lives, but individual identity itself. The enemy they faced had learned to become them. Their only hope lay in becoming something the enemy had never encountered, something that transcended the very concept of separate species struggling for survival. In the void beyond the galaxy's edge, the hive mind of Ouroboros processed the data flowing from its advanced organisms with something approaching satisfaction. The Alliance's cooperation had provided templates for organization that would prove valuable when consuming future galaxies. Yet their current desperation suggested they might attempt something unprecedented. Such innovation would provide the most valuable lessons of all. The Great Devourer had consumed countless forms of unity across the eons, each adding to its vast catalogue of organizational patterns. If this galaxy's children could achieve genuine synthesis, their absorption would add new dimensions to the swarm's understanding of cooperative consciousness. The feast was no longer merely about biomass or even genetic templates. It had become an education in the ultimate limits of unity itself. And when that education was complete, the hive mind would carry its lessons to the next galaxy, armed with the knowledge of how consciousness itself could be absorbed and improved upon. There are moments when destiny reveals itself not as distant possibility, but as immediate necessity, stripping away all pretense and leaving only the choice between transformation and extinction. The convergence upon the galactic core system came not through grand strategy, but through desperate recognition that conventional warfare, no matter how perfectly coordinated, could not defeat an enemy that had learned to perfect unity itself. What followed would determine whether the galaxy's children could transcend the very concept of separate species struggling for survival. The primary hive ship of Ouroboros hung in the void like a malignant star, its biomass exceeding the combined fleets of every faction that had ever existed. Around it, lesser hive ships formed defensive formations that stretched across light years, their organic hulls pulsing with the stolen memories of every Alliance victory they had absorbed. Yet it was not the ship's size that struck terror into the hearts of those who beheld it, but its beauty, a terrible aesthetic perfection that incorporated the finest elements of every galactic civilization's architectural traditions. Spires that recalled the Gothic grandeur of imperial cathedrals rose from bio-hulls that flowed with the organic curves favored by Tau design philosophy. Weapon systems that demonstrated the brutal efficiency of Orc engineering were arranged according to principles of harmony that spoke of Eldar influence. Even the Dark Eldar's cruel artistry was represented in formations that promised exquisite suffering to any who dared approach. The Silent King's tomb fleet emerged from hyperspace at the system's edge, their quantum displacement fields creating ripples in reality itself. Zarek stood upon the bridge of the Obsidian Mausoleum, his ancient consciousness processing tactical data that spanned multiple dimensions simultaneously. Around him, the combined fleets of the Alliance took their positions according to battle plans that had been forged not through military doctrine, but through shared understanding that transcended species boundaries. Imperial Navy battleships hung in formation alongside elegant Eldar vessels, their crews linked through psychic networks that allowed for coordination that exceeded anything conventional command structures could achieve. Tau exploration fleets provided long-range sensor data that was instantly shared across all Allied forces through communication systems that incorporated technologies from every faction. The primary hive ship contains the core consciousness that coordinates the entire swarm, reported Magos Biologist Kavul, through neural links that connected his augmented consciousness to every Allied commander simultaneously. Yet our analysis indicates that conventional assault will only provide it with additional templates for adaptation. Victory requires something unprecedented. From the Space Marine strike cruiser, Macrage's Honor, Rabut Gilliman coordinated the ground assault through battle cant that had been modified to incorporate tactical terminology from every Allied species. The Primarch who had once led humanity's great crusade now commanded forces that represented every faction that had ever fought for survival in the galaxy's long history. Boarding parties will consist of integrated units that demonstrate true synthesis rather than mere cooperation, Gilliman announced through Vox networks that reached every corner of the Allied fleet. We go not as separate species working together, but as a single people defending our shared home. The assault began with a bombardment that defied every principle of conventional warfare. Necron Gorse weapons carved through hive ship defenses, while Imperial macro cannons provided covering fire for Tau railgun strikes that had been precisely calculated to exploit the weaknesses revealed by Eldar Farsight. Yet the true breakthrough came through attacks that incorporated not just multiple technologies, but multiple forms of consciousness working in perfect harmony. Eldred Ulthran stood within a ritual circle that had been carved into the deck of an Imperial battle barge, his consciousness reaching across the void to touch the minds of beings he would once have considered abominations. Chaos sorcerers from the Thousand Suns added their psychic might to workings that incorporated the discipline of Eldar tradition with the raw power that came from 10,000 years of exposure to the warp's chaotic energies. The boundaries between order and chaos, loyalty and heresy, become meaningless in the face of extinction, Eldrad observed, as psychic energies that should have torn reality apart, instead wove together in patterns that opened pathways directly into the hive ship's core. We achieve unity, not through similarity, but through the synthesis of all our contradictions. The boarding assault that followed challenged every assumption about the nature of warfare and identity that had shaped galactic civilization. Space Marine Terminators fought alongside Orc Nobs, their combined mass providing breakthrough capability that neither could have achieved alone. Tau Crisis suits provided fire support for Imperial Guard regiments, their targeting systems linked through battlefield networks that allowed for precision that transcended individual capability. Yet it was the presence of beings who had abandoned individual identity entirely that proved most effective against the hive ship's defenses. Warriors who had voluntarily merged their consciousness through psychic bonds that transcended species barriers, creating combined entities that possessed the best attributes of all Alliance factions while maintaining the essential spark that made them more than mere biological machines. Chapter Master Dante of the Blood Angels found himself fighting alongside Gazakul, Mag Uruk Thraka, in bio-corridors that pulsed with stolen memories of every battle the Alliance had ever fought. The ancient Space Marine and the massive Orc war boss moved with coordination that spoke of shared consciousness rather than mere tactical cooperation. "Never thought I'd die fighting beside an Orc," Dante said, as his power sword carved through bioforms that demonstrated perfect knowledge of Space Marine combat doctrine. Ghazghkul's response came through Vox systems that had been modified to accommodate his massive vocal apparatus. "We ain't dying, Space Marine. We's becoming something that's gonna live forever. The best fight any of us ever had." The advance through the hive ship's interior became a journey through the stolen memories of galactic civilization itself. Biochambers that reproduced the tactical scenarios from every major battle in Imperial history. Organic weapons systems that demonstrated mastery of technologies that each faction had considered their unique advantage. Synaptic nodes that pulsed with the absorbed consciousness of fallen heroes from every species. Yet the Alliance warriors who penetrated deepest into the ship's core were no longer recognizable as members of individual factions. They had become something genuinely new, beings who retained their essential identity while sharing consciousness with warriors from every allied species. The synthesis that the Silent King had spoken of was no longer theoretical, but manifest in the form of fighters who demonstrated capabilities that no individual faction could achieve. The final chamber of the hive ship's core contained the ultimate expression of Tyranid adaptation, a consciousness that had absorbed not just the tactical knowledge of the Alliance, but their very concepts of cooperation, sacrifice, and unity. The entity that confronted the Alliance assault was beautiful in its terrible perfection, incorporating the best attributes of every species while serving the Great Devourer's infinite hunger. Yet it was this very perfection that revealed the fundamental flaw in the Tyranid understanding of unity. The hive mind had absorbed the forms of cooperation without comprehending the essence that made cooperation possible, the willingness to sacrifice not just individual lives, but individual identity for something greater than any single being could achieve. The Silent King was the first to understand what victory required. Standing in the hive ship's core chamber, surrounded by bioforms that demonstrated perfect knowledge of Necron combat capabilities, Zarek began the process of voluntary dissolution that would merge his consciousness with the psychic network that connected all Alliance forces. Unity cannot be absorbed because it is not a thing but a choice, the last of the Silent Kings said, as his ancient consciousness began to merge with the collective will of the Alliance. We become one, not through conquest, but through willing surrender of what we were to become what we must be. The transformation spread through the Alliance forces like fire through dry grass. Individual identity remained, but was enhanced by connection to a greater whole that transcended the limitations of any single species. Guilliman's strategic brilliance merged with Tau tactical precision, Eldrad's psychic mastery combined with the raw power of chaos sorcery. Ghazghkul's intuitive understanding of warfare joined with Space Marine discipline. The entity that emerged from this synthesis was unlike anything that had ever existed in the galaxy's history, a collective consciousness that retained the essential nature of each contributing species while achieving capabilities that none could have imagined alone. It was this unprecedented form of unity that finally provided the weapon necessary to destroy the hive mind's core. The confrontation that followed could not be described in conventional terms of violence or warfare. It was a battle between different concepts of what consciousness itself could become. The hive mind's perfection, achieved through absorption and replication, met the Alliance's synthesis, born from willing transformation and mutual sacrifice. In the end, it was the very willingness to lose individual identity that proved the key to victory. The hive mind, for all its vast intelligence and adaptive capability, could not comprehend the concept of conscious beings choosing to become something greater than themselves. Its attempts to absorb the Alliance consciousness failed because there was nothing separate left to absorb, only a unified whole that existed beyond the reach of consumption. The destruction of the core consciousness sent shock waves through every Tyranid organism in the galaxy. Bioships that had seemed unstoppable suddenly drifted helpless in the void, their crews severed from the synaptic networks that had given them purpose. Swarms that had adapted to counter every Alliance tactic found themselves unable to function without the central intelligence that had coordinated their evolution. Yet victory came at a cost that transformed the very nature of what the Alliance had become. The beings who emerged from the hive ship's core were no longer fully human, Eldar, Tau, or any single species. They had become something genuinely new, a synthesis of consciousness that retained the best of all their traditions while transcending the limitations that had once defined them. As the Alliance fleets began the long process of eliminating the now helpless Tyranid organisms scattered across the galaxy, those who had achieved synthesis found themselves facing a future that neither victory nor defeat had prepared them for. They had saved the galaxy, but in doing so, they had become something that the galaxy had never seen before. The stars burned with their ancient light above the wreckage of the Great Devourer's greatest fleet, yet that light now shone upon a civilization that had fundamentally transformed itself. The children of the galaxy had faced the ultimate test of unity and had chosen to become something greater than the sum of their parts. In the deep void beyond the galaxy's edge, the scattered remnants of the hive mind processed the data of their first true defeat with something approaching comprehension. The Alliance had achieved something genuinely unprecedented, unity that transcended absorption because it was based on willing transformation rather than forced integration. The lesson would prove valuable when encountering future galaxies. Yet for now, the Great Devourer would have to seek sustenance elsewhere, carrying with it the knowledge that consciousness itself could evolve beyond the reach of consumption when beings chose to become something greater than their individual selves. The feast had ended, not in victory or defeat, but in transformation that neither predator nor prey had anticipated. Victory is the cruelest teacher, for it reveals not just what was preserved, but what was forever lost in the preservation. As the last of the Tyranid bioships fell silent in the void, their organic hulls drifting like monuments to hunger finally sated, the galaxy's survivors found themselves confronting a question that no military doctrine had prepared them to answer. What remains when the enemy is defeated? But the very act of defeating them has transformed the defenders beyond recognition. The cost could be measured in numbers that defied comprehension. Entire sectors had been consumed, their worlds reduced to barren rock, stripped of every trace of life. Fleets that had taken millennia to build lay scattered across light years of void, their wreckage serving as tomb markers for crews who had chosen synthesis over survival. The population of the galaxy had been reduced by billions, each death a thread cut from the tapestry of galactic civilization. Yet it was the incalculable losses that weighed most heavily upon those who remained. The Silent King's willing dissolution had left the Necron dynasties without the central authority that had guided them for millions of years. Overlords who had followed Zarek's commands since before humanity's birth now faced an existence without the unifying purpose that his sacrifice had represented. Overlord Anraker stood upon the tomb world of Pyria, watching as his fellow Necrons attempted to comprehend a future that their Creator King would never see. The ancient warrior's optical sensors registered data that his consciousness struggled to process: purpose without dominion, existence without the eternal quest for redemption that had driven them since their awakening. The Silent King chose transformation over preservation, Anrakir said to the assembled overlords, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of loss beyond mortal understanding. We who remain must decide whether his sacrifice creates obligation or liberation. Do we continue the unity he died to achieve, or return to the isolation that defined us for eons? Similar questions echoed across the galaxy as the surviving members of each faction confronted the fundamental changes that victory had wrought. The Space Marine chapters who had fought alongside Chaos war bands found their sacred doctrines challenged by memories of cooperation with the very enemies they had been created to destroy. How could they return to the Codex Astartes when they had witnessed the effectiveness of tactics learned from heretics and traitors? Chapter Master Calgar stood before the Ultramarines' assembled captains, his ancient armor bearing scars from battles that would have been unthinkable before the Alliance. Around him, warriors who had bled beside Fire warriors and Eldar rangers struggled to reconcile their experiences with 10,000 years of Imperial doctrine. We swore oaths to the Emperor that transcend circumstance, Calgar said, his voice carrying the weight of tradition against the pressure of transformation. Yet we have learned that loyalty to humanity's survival may require abandoning our preconceptions about humanity's enemies. The question before us is whether growth constitutes betrayal or the highest form of service. The technological revolution that emerged from forced cooperation promised to transform galactic civilization as profoundly as the Alliance itself had changed its participants. Tau Earth caste engineers worked alongside Imperial tech adepts to refine hybrid technologies that incorporated the best elements of both traditions, weapons that combined Imperial durability with Tau precision, shield systems that merged Necron temporal manipulation with Eldar dimensional understanding. Yet these innovations came with philosophical implications that challenge the foundational beliefs of every faction. The Adeptus Mechanicus found their understanding of the Omnissiah expanded by exposure to Xenos machine spirits that demonstrated intelligence indistinguishable from Imperial cogitators. The Tau discovered that their greater good had evolved beyond the boundaries of species to encompass forms of consciousness they had never imagined possible. Magus Cowell stood within his forge laboratories on Mars, studying data streams that flowed with insights borrowed from a dozen different species' understanding of technology and consciousness. His augmented mind processed information that would have been heretical months before, yet now seemed essential to the continued advancement of human knowledge. Innovation requires the synthesis of disparate elements, Call observed to his assembled tech adepts. The Alliance has provided us with conceptual frameworks that expand our comprehension of the machine spirit beyond purely Imperial interpretations. The question becomes whether we embrace this expansion or retreat into doctrinal purity. The Eldar faced their own existential challenges as the Alliance's success forced them to reconsider 10,000 years of decline and withdrawal from galactic affairs. Craft worlds that had spent millennia avoiding contact with younger races now hosted mixed-species crews that demonstrated the vitality that Eldar civilization had been lacking. The sight of Mon-Ki warriors fighting with the dedication that had once marked only the most devoted aspect. Warriors challenged every assumption about racial superiority. Farseer Eldrad walked the crystal paths of Ulthwé, his ancient consciousness processing probability threads that had been transformed by the Alliance's unprecedented cooperation. Visions that had once shown only decline and eventual extinction now revealed possibilities that stretched beyond the boundaries of Eldar racial destiny. The paths of fate have been rewritten by our choices, Eldrad said to the assembled seers of the craft world. Where once I foresaw only endings, Now I perceive beginnings that our people never dared imagine. Yet prophecy without interpretation is merely data. We must decide what these new possibilities mean for our future. The psychological transformation proved more challenging than any technological innovation. Warriors who had learned to fight alongside their ancient enemies discovered that old hatreds had been replaced not by friendship, but by a complex understanding that transcended simple categories of ally and adversary. Imperial Guard veterans spoke of tall commanders with respect earned through shared sacrifice. Eldar Aspect warriors acknowledged the courage of human space marines who had died to preserve craft-world populations. Yet it was among the Chaos Space Marines that the most profound philosophical shifts occurred. War bands that had spent 10,000 years fighting against the Imperium found themselves questioning whether their rebellion had preserved or perverted the values they claimed to serve. The sight of loyalist space marines accepting cooperation with Xenos, and even heretics, forced a reconsideration of what constituted true service to humanity's future. Warsmith Honso, survivor of battles that had claimed heroes from every faction, stood before his assembled Iron Warriors as they contemplated a galaxy that no longer offered the certainties that had defined their existence since the Horus heresy. The siege specialist who had spent millennia perfecting the art of tearing down imperial fortifications now faced the question of what to build in the ruins of old certainties. We chose rebellion because we believed the Imperium had betrayed the ideals of the Great Crusade, Honsu said to his warriors. Yet in fighting beside loyalists against a greater threat, we discovered that those ideals may have evolved beyond the forms we expected. The question remains whether evolution constitutes corruption or maturation. The Orc contribution to the Alliance had been the most straightforward. Violence applied with enthusiasm to a target that deserved destruction. Yet even the simplest-minded Orcs found themselves changed by exposure to the tactical sophistication and technological excellence of their temporary allies. War bosses who had learned to coordinate with Tau commanders discovered that planning could enhance rather than diminish the joy of combat. War boss Gazg Kul, scarred by battles that had elevated him beyond simple Orcish understanding, addressed his assembled clans with observations that would have been impossible before the Alliance. The Beast of Armageddon had learned that the greatest fights required not just individual strength, but collective purpose. "We fought the biggest fight the galaxy ever seen," Gazkul rumbled to his followers. "And we won because we learned that sometimes you gotta work with the enemy to fight a bigger enemy. The question is whether the next fight's gonna be as good as this one, or whether we go back to the old way of just fighting each Uva." Even the Dark Eldar found themselves transformed by participation in something greater than their own hedonistic pursuits. Raiders who had contributed to the Alliance's victory discovered that preservation could provide satisfactions that destruction alone had never offered. Archon Vect, master of Komarag's labyrinthine politics, contemplated changes that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which Dark Eldar society had been built. "We participated in creation rather than destruction," Vect observed to his assembled cabals. The experience was illuminating. Whether such illumination represents growth or contamination remains to be determined. As the galaxy began the process of reconstruction, the question of whether the Alliance would endure beyond the threat that had created it loomed over every decision. Trade agreements between species that had been mortal enemies, joint military exercises that maintained readiness for future threats, cultural exchanges that explored the philosophical implications of cooperation that transcended racial boundaries. Yet beneath the surface of cooperation, older patterns of suspicion and competition began to reassert themselves. Imperial worlds that had been defended by Xenos forces now debated whether gratitude justified continued cooperation with non-human species. Toe colonies that had been preserved by imperial sacrifice questioned whether the greater good required permanent accommodation with human authoritarianism. The final test of the alliance's durability would come not from external threats, but from the question of whether the transformation achieved through necessity could survive the return of choice. In council chambers across the galaxy, representatives of each faction debated the future of cooperation that had saved them all, but might not survive the peace it had created. Commander Dante, ancient beyond the span of normal human life, stood before the assembled leadership of the Alliance as they gathered to decide whether their unprecedented cooperation would endure or dissolve. The Blood Angel who had witnessed the birth and maturation of the galaxy's most unlikely unity now faced the question of whether such unity could transcend the circumstances of its creation. "We have proven that extinction can be faced when all choose to stand as one," Dante said, his voice carrying the weight of battles that had transformed the galaxy itself. Yet the cost of that unity, and whether it can endure beyond the threat that forged it, remains a question for the ages yet to come. Around him, representatives who had learned to see beyond the boundaries of their own species contemplated a future that remained unwritten. The Tyranid threat had been defeated, but in defeating it, they had become something that the galaxy had never seen before. Whether that transformation would prove lasting or temporary remained the greatest mystery of all. The stars burned above worlds that had been saved through cooperation that transcended every tradition of galactic history. Yet their light illuminated civilizations that could no longer claim the certainty of old hatreds or ancient purposes. The children of the galaxy had faced the ultimate test of unity and had chosen transformation over extinction. What they would choose to become in the ages that followed remained unwritten, a story yet to be told among the stars that had witnessed the birth of something unprecedented in the long annals of time. The war for survival had ended, but the greater challenge of defining what survival meant had only just begun.